Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to the webinar series Unearthing Gold Histories. My name is Maddie Moore, and I'm the Advocacy Strategic Manager at the National Trust of Australia Victoria and the coordinator of the Australian Heritage Festival in Victoria. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm hosting this meeting from the lands of the Wurundjeri people. I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands on which you all join us today. I pay my respects to their elders, both past and present, and acknowledge their continuing connections to land, waters, and community. This webinar series is being run in partnership with the Victorian Goldfields World Heritage Bid as part of the 2025 Australian Heritage Festival. Each year, the National Trust, the state's premier community-based heritage advocacy organisation, coordinates the Australian Heritage Festival in Victoria, providing a program of internally and externally produced events. Running from the 18th of April to the 18th of May, the festival is the state's largest annual celebration of heritage, and in 2025, the Australian Heritage Festival is supported by the Heritage Council of Victoria and the Victorian Goldfields World Heritage Bid. Today's presentation will describe how the discovery of gold in May 1855 on the Emu Hill pastoral run, about 35 kilometres southwest of Ballarat, commenced a transformation of this peaceful landscape. Jill Wheeler has a PhD in history from the University of Melbourne. Her thesis was a history of a small goldfields town in southwestern Victoria called Linton, which resulted in a publication entitled Linton Makes History, an Australian goldfields town and its past in 2015. Jill has been president of the Linton District Historical Society since 2010, and with her co-author, Del Atkinson, has since published Linton, A Photographic History in 2017, and an historic walk-drive tour of Linton in 2019. Jill takes an active interest in the preservation of history and heritage in Linton and the Golden Plains Shire, and has twice received a Senior Citizen of the Year award for her services to local history preservation and promotion in the Shire's Australia Day Awards. Over to you, Jill.
Uncovering lesser-known stories of Victorian goldfields towns. My name's Jill Wheeler, and I've done research for a PhD and a book on the history of a small country town called Linton. This presentation is entitled How Gold Created Linton, A Nuanced History. In it, I'll describe how the discovery of gold in May 1855 on the Emu Hill pastoral run, about 35 kilometres southwest of Ballarat, commenced a dramatic transformation of this peaceful landscape. Already occupied by the Linton family from Scotland, who along with other squatters had displaced the Wathawurrung people, this place became known as Lintons Diggings, a feverish hive of gold seekers living in tents. Ultimately, it developed into a permanent settlement that became Linton, the principal town in the future Grenville Shire. First slide, please. While what is known as a three cheers approach to the history of the gold rush tends to celebrate enormous gold finds and quick riches, I will use the history of this one small town to illustrate a more nuanced picture. This will include the often forgotten role of women on the goldfields, the influence of the Chinese miners, and the impact on children and the environment. And I'll challenge the Australian progress story about gold seeking as a stimulating a spirit of individualist enterprise which militated against class and industrial conflict. This map on your screen is a map of the Wathawurrung languages and clans and shows Linton more or less in the top mid-left, and this is how it was when the Europeans arrived. This relatively quiet, sparsely settled area, described in 1841 as wooded hilly country, became the site of the first gold discoveries in this part of the Wathawurrung goldfield. May 1855 is regarded as the date when gold was officially discovered in a gully on the northern portion of the Emu Hill pastoral run. It was named Bloomer's Gully after one of the party of Americans who sank a shaft there. close to other unsuccessful ones, and struck gold. Other discoveries followed quickly, and the area became known as Lintons Diggings. Soon, the forested landscape gave way to a bustling multicultural settlement, largely housed in tents. Next slide, please. This is a map of the Wathawurrung Goldfields, and Linton is in the top left corner. As well as shops, businesses and a hotel, by 1856 there were weekly church services, Church of England, Methodist and Catholic, and a school under Anglican control with 56 children's names on the roll. The Ballarat Times and Crop on 15th of September 1855 reported the growing prosperity of the goldfield, describing Nuggety Gully as being where, quote, the diggers are now seen working as thick as bees. With the discovery of the Black Lead, located further southeast of the original gullies, the paper predicted, quote, so sure as there is gold in Victoria, will this same Black Lead become one of our greatest mines. Next slide, please. This slide shows the method by which alluvial mining was originally done. It's called cradling. And the original gold mining operations at Lintons Diggings were like this in the 1850s and 60s. Involved one or two or even four men striking small claims. And this cradling was where gold was extracted from the river. This next slide shows Paddy Crane, who was a local in the 1930s and still using traditional methods to seek gold around Linton at that time. It just shows what it would have been like in the 1850s and 60s. And he's shown here in his own private personal mine and panning for gold. As with most early goldfields, the population at Lintons Diggings fluctuated wildly. Miners moved on quickly if yields were not rich. William Raymond wrote in his diary, in 1855, started for Lintons Diggings, made tucker, worked for 5 months at the deep sinking on the Black Lead. October, started for Derwent Jacks. So a stay of 5 months was probably pretty typical. A reading of the first 5 inquests held at Linton at the end of 1855 gives an indication of the precariousness of life on an 1850s goldfield. In October, a Chinese miner called Lop Su was killed from the falling in of stone and earth upon him while working in the drive of his hole. This was the first recorded mining death at Lintons Diggings. In November, Samuel Rayner, a storekeeper at the diggings, was found dead in the bush after being missing for several days. His death was concluded to be, quote, from natural causes accelerated by excessive drinking and exposure to cold. Shortly after, John Taylor killed his wife Anne by striking her on the head with an axe in a fit of jealousy, and then drowned himself just over 2 weeks later. On the 14th of December, 14-month-old Joseph Fielding drowned in about 2 feet of water near his family's tent. Despite his mother's frantic efforts and those of other women who, quote, put the child into hot water and had him rubbed over with brandy. The historian David Goodman has argued that despite later assumptions, not everyone during the gold rush era saw gold as a path to social progress. Some feared that gold fever would lead to social degeneration, to disorder and moral decline. The absence of wives and families, combined with sudden wealth and male-dominated camps, raised concerns about unchecked masculinity and class upheaval. One such pessimist was James Bonwick, who toured Western Victoria, including Lintons Diggings in 1857, as an inspector of denominational schools. He warned that, quote, If we go on much longer as a vagrant people, the practice of celibacy and its concomitant evils will be a settled habit, leading to a reckless, homeless, dissipated race ready for any revolutionary violence. Bonwick advocated for leases to be granted to what he called settled men rather than parties of working miners, and for stronger government paternal supervision and control, including movable school buildings, circulating libraries of approved works, and moral education efforts. Despite these concerns, Bonwick acknowledged that Lintons Diggings appeared to have, quote, moral exponents rather above the usual standard, attributing this to, quote, the settled character of the locality and the prevalence of married people. He found satisfaction in addressing miners there about self-education, noting their attentiveness and receptivity. David Goodman also points out how the gold rush disrupted Victoria's dominant agrarian ideology, the belief that true wealth came from farming and that settlers had a moral responsibility to cultivate the land. Gold mining threatened this order. Not only did it shift wealth to ordinary diggers, but it also physically intruded on private pastoral runs. This moral outrage is evident in the 1860 submission to Parliament by John Brown, son-in-law of Joseph and Mary and Linton and lessee of the Emu Hill and Moppieanimum runs. Brown applied for compensation for stock losses during the 1856 rush. He claimed, quote, a large number of diggers from 10 to 12 or 15,000 had come upon his 2 runs, and a very large number of his sheep and lambs had been scattered and killed by the diggers and their dogs. Despite submitting a petition to the acting governor in October 1856, the losses continued until he was forced to remove about 20,000 sheep from his runs, many of which, he said, were dying of starvation. He sold them at less than half their value and estimated his losses at nearly £10,000. He had argued that Crown licences had given him confidence he wouldn't be dispossessed without notice, but the Select Committee disagreed and denied compensation. Early histories of Linton celebrate the wealth of the goldfield, naming prominent mines, their managers, and profitable shareholdings. However, mining surveyors' reports from 1859 into the 1890s show that Linton's gold production fluctuated considerably. Within the Wathawurrung goldfield, Linton was at best a steady producer until the 1880s, before declining into the 20th century. By 1859, numerous deep alluvial mining companies had formed, 30 by 1865, and the era of the individual miner with pick and shovel was waning. Most miners were now employees of deep lead companies, as the cost of equipment made independent mining unfeasible. Next slide, please. These photos show some examples of deep lead mining around Linton. Some miners held shares or worked on contract for these companies. However, employment was often erratic. Companies reduced staff when yields dropped or ran mines intermittently, leaving miners in search of work. Later in the century, as gold yields declined, miners worked increasingly on tribute, a system where miners worked for themselves in groups, paid royalties to the company, and supplied their own tools, timber, and explosives. Companies used this system to reduce costs when wage labour became unprofitable. Tributes could be let for 6 to 12 months, but could be terminated at any time by management. Next slide, please. This slide shows a photograph of the miners who were in the Pittville Plains in about 1905, but it gives an example of how of the deep lead mining equipment behind and the miners who with just candles to light their way. You can see the candles in their pockets, went down in the deep leads. Many well-known deep lead mining companies at Linton were soon implicated in fatal accidents. The first was in November 1861, when George Downing, a shareholder in the Glamorgan Company, died while removing a set of timber. The company was doing well at the time, selling over £200 worth of gold weekly to the local Bank of New South Wales. A fall of earth crushed Downing, breaking his neck. An inquest ruled it was an accidental death. More deaths followed. In September 1862, an unnamed mine in Bloomer's Gully, Thomas Jewell and James Hill were killed when the roof of their drive collapsed. 200 men worked for 6 hours to recover bodies. Jewell left behind a wife and 5 children. Hill, who had been a shareholder in the claim, was married with 2 children. An inquest concluded that poor timbering caused the collapse. One juror, Christopher Barnett, objected, saying it was, quote, willful negligence and not accident, unquote. But the coroner explained that such a verdict would imply murder or manslaughter. After discussion, the verdict was amended to state that, quote, if the mine had been properly timbered, the accident would not have happened. The worst disaster occurred on the 14th of July 1882 in a Linton Park mine known as the Argyle. Water from an abandoned nearby mine broke through into the main drive. While some escaped, 1 Chinese tributor drowned and 7 others were trapped for 12 hours. 6 horses also drowned. Local papers reported the great drama at Linton with residents rushing to help. Miners Adam Clinton and James Cameron descended into the flooded shaft, and despite water reaching their chins, rescued the survivors. The body of the drowned miner, Artoy, was later recovered. At the inquest, the Inspector of Mines called it, quote, a miracle that the men were not all drowned. The present and previous mine managers claimed they had no reliable information about the nearby flooded workings, and although a prosecution against the manager was initiated, it was later dismissed for this reason. From 1878 onward, all coronial inquests in Linton involved Chinese miners. In the 1890s, many died not from accidents, but from miners' phthisis, a form of tuberculosis usually developed over years of underground work. The environmental impact of gold mining is another aspect not dwelt on in Linton's official histories. The most successful mining around Linton was alluvial, both shallow sinking and deep lead. We often imagine alluvial mining as small scale and benign, a cradle, a tub, a dish. But full-scale alluvial mining caused major environmental damage. A 1912 local history described the Wathawurrung River in the 1850s as, quote, a picturesque stream in which blackfish and eels abounded. Wildfowl haunted the pools. Kangaroo, emu and wild turkey roamed through the forest. This scene was soon to be sadly disfigured by the sludge and mullock heaps of the mines. Deep lead mining required enormous quantities of timber for supports, fuel and infrastructure. By 1879, the Victorian Gazetteer reported that the Wathawurrung River was, quote, so polluted with sludge from the mining claims that no fish can exist therein. Malcolm Mackay, a local fossicker in the 1930s, imagined the scene thus, quote, Linton was totally different about that time. There would be almost no trees left standing. Props, ladders, blocking poles and other timber were needed below. The boilers burned about 10 cords of wood in 24 hours. Every scrap of wood was used. You can picture the entire area almost denuded. In 2005, the Department of Sustainability and Environment found that native vegetation around Linton was still recovering. They estimated that no trees more than 100 years old remain and describe the topsoil as thin and hungry. The historians McCalman, Cook and Reeves argue that gold rushes intensified institutionalised racism, not only towards Chinese miners, but also through increased dispossession of Aboriginal people. Yet they also highlight the resistance and agency of the oppressed. So how did the Wathawurrung people fare in the Linton district? In their article on Aboriginal presence on the Western Victorian Goldfields, the historians Clark and Carr argue against the perception that Aboriginal people were absent or merely passive. They show that Aboriginal people were not just attached to pastoral stations and were not living only at the fringes of mining towns, and they were not bewildered spectators as they were sometimes portrayed. Instead, they were often actively involved as traders, labourers, gold seekers and observers, drawn by the novelty and opportunity of goldfield life. For example, the American Charles Ferguson reported that he quote, met a number of Wathawurrung blacks at Lintons Diggings about 1855, the tribe numbering some 200. One of them told him he knew where there was plenty of gold about 60 miles away and offered to take him there. The party found gold at this place, which later became known as the Ararat Diggings. Earlier, at Happy Valley Diggings, he and a mate, who were anxious to set up a provision store for the diggers there, hired some local Aboriginal people. Quote, to strip some bark while we cut some poles, and by the third day, after leaving Ballarat, we had our store up and complete with the help that the boys had given us. However, access to alcohol increased dramatically with the arrival of the miners. Bonwick had noted as early as 1852 at the new diggings at Ballarat that some diggers encouraged Aboriginal drinking for amusement. However, there's also evidence of positive exchange. Aboriginal people traded possum skin rugs with both European and Chinese miners. When Na Hock, a Chinese digger, was found dead in 1872 near Linton, his body was covered, quote, with old bags and an old piece of possum skin. Although gold intensified the decline of local Indigenous populations, there is ample evidence of Aboriginal presence and interaction at Lintons Diggings. Next slide, please. Chinese miners were present at Linton from the beginning. Linton lay on the route from Robe in South Australia, where they were disembarked, to Ballarat, Bendigo and other eastern goldfields. This map shows the Chinese route from Robe to the Victorian Goldfields. One estimate claimed that 20,000 Chinese diggers remained at Linton when most of the diggers departed for Mount Ararat in August 1857. Although the 1857 census recorded the population of Lintons Diggings as 637, 418 who were males and 219 who were females. This census typically excluded Chinese residents, so the real population would have been significantly higher. Despite discrimination, Chinese miners remained a significant enduring presence on the Linton Goldfields. The mining surveyor, John Lynch, reporting on the Smythesdale division, of which Linton was a part, in June 1859, praised the Chinese diggers, quote, for their close and diligent attention to business and their systematic mode of working. He described them as orderly and well worthy of imitation. By October 1859, the original gullies, Candlestick, Bloomers, Nuggety and Wet Flat, were predominantly worked by Chinese miners. At the hard hills just north of these gullies, Lynch noted several Chinese encampments where miners were all making wages. This area had become almost exclusively Chinese. They built dams, horse puddling machines and reworked old deposits through puddling, sluicing and surfacing. In August 1860, Lynch reported they were still being, quote, well recompensed in the majority of cases. In 1862, the Melbourne Argus observed that many Chinese miners at Linton had done well the previous year and returned home to China for others, bringing back additional provisions. The Argus correspondence continues, quote, among the things to be brought are tea, coffee, rice, and vegetable dye seeds, also tools and implements. It is their intention to get gold in one company while the other cultivates the crops named, which has the appearance of a wise arrangement. Next slide, please. These stories, along with inquest records and cemetery burials, disprove the myth that Chinese miners were merely transient. At least 25 men were buried in Linton between 1900 and 1928. Several of them married local women, and many of them died from long-term illnesses like phthisis, as I've already mentioned. This slide shows Jimmy Lee Ching is one of the original Chinese men who came to Linton in the 19th century, and this is him pictured in the 1920s when he still lived there and worked as a market gardener. The existence of women and children on the goldfields has often been overlooked in Australian history, but archival traces and early inquests at Linton show they were there from the beginning, often as active participants in goldfield life. The historian Susan Lawrence, in her archaeological study of the Lintons Diggings, has shown that the mere presence of women on the goldfields led to more substantial tents, gardens, and domestic animals for food. This would have been true in Linton too. Women cared for children, ran businesses, and worked as midwives. Mary Rayner helped run a store with her husband at Lintons Diggings in 1855. Anne Taylor and Louisa Sewell were partners in a dressmaking business that same year. Mary Gillies attended twin births in 1862, and Anne Foster, who had, quote, great experience as a midwife, assisted in a difficult tent birth later that year. Next slide, please. Children were present in large numbers. 3 different schools were established on Linton's goldfields from as early as 1856. These eventually combined in 1867 to form Linton State School number 880. By 1875, enrolment had reached 242 students. Women also taught in these schools. Harriet Wilson and Eliza Walters were both head teachers at the earlier Lintons Diggings schools and later became the 2 consecutive assistant teachers at the newly formed Linton State School. But children were also among the casualties of goldfield life. Inquests reveal frequent deaths from accidents and contagious diseases. In the records of the newly surveyed cemetery after 1860, children were overrepresented in early burials, especially those under the age of 3. To be a child on the early goldfields was to live a life full of risk. And this photo shows the earliest known photograph of the Linton School pupils and their teachers. And there's Miss Heather Milne on the far right. In 1860, a large number of people from Lintons Diggings moved to what was known as Surface Hill, along with houses and shops. Next slide, please. No reason for the move to this site is stated. However, as Bernard Barrett points out in his study of the origin of local communities and local government in Victoria, after the discovery of gold, the miners were quickly joined by storekeepers, and typically, quote, the initiative in developing the town was taken by storekeepers rather than by miners. The site chosen for the town of Linton was on the main road from the food-producing plains of the Western District to markets in the goldfields at Ballarat and beyond. It was on a hill about equidistant from both the earlier Lintons Diggings and the standard lead diggings. Thus, the choice of site seems strategic from the storekeeper's point of view. Government surveyors in late 1860 laid out the township with wide streets in the standard grid pattern characteristic of Australian towns, large and small, and a settlement took root. Here's the map, a much later map, but it shows you the layout of the town, which still exists today. A hectic bout of civic activity in the early 1860s resulted in the establishment of municipal institutions and 4 churches and many private businesses, and ultimately the proclamation of the Shire of Grenville in 1864 with Linton as its centre. Next slide, please. These pictures show the 2 examples of this building frenzy. There was the Bank of New South Wales, 1862, and the new Shire offices also began in 1862, although that photo is considerably later. Although at this time the majority of the population, which totalled 1,969 people, was still living at the old Diggings township, this had changed by the 1881 census, when over 81% of the people had moved to the new town. Next slide, please. This is an example. These photos show the new businesses that were established, a butchery and a hotel. Also shows the Edinburgh gold mine, which was really close to the hotel and quite in the town, in fact. Next slide, please. More examples of businesses, the saddler, butcher shop, and the Colliver's wheelwright. And next slide, please. And the undertaker, Nelson, and the Public Library and Mechanics Institute. The story of gold in Linton is not just about sudden wealth and successful companies. It's also a story of fluctuating fortunes, difficult living conditions, and social upheaval. Next slide, please. It reminds us that environmental destruction was an overlooked consequence of gold mining, and it shows that beneath the official histories, there are human stories of hardship, courage, loss, and community. It challenges the traditional progress narrative by revealing a goldfield that was cosmopolitan and diverse, not just Anglo-Celtic men, but Chinese and Indigenous people, women, and children. Next slide, please. The remains of these gold diggings are more than just ruins. They are an ongoing presence in and around Linton, a cultural landscape with the power to vividly tell the story of Linton's gold history. Gold is the reason that the town of Linton came to be, and the central motive in Linton's historical idea of itself. Last slide, please. And these are some photographs of Linton today, and you can still see some of the historic buildings there, and the town's layout much as it was established in the 1860s. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill, for such a fantastic presentation. I hope everybody watching thoroughly enjoyed that, and we'll hope to see you next week for the final webinar in this series. Thank you.